The atmosphere inside the Loose Women's studio that afternoon was anything but ordinary. From the moment Meghan Markle walked onto the set, the audience sensed an undercurrent of anticipation, the kind that usually precedes a headline-making television moment. She was there, ostensibly, to promote her latest humanitarian initiative via a global mentorship program for young women, but it was clear even before the cameras rolled that her mere presence was going to provoke a more charged discussion. Meghan's entrance was met with polite applause, but also a subtle stiffness from some of the panelists, particularly Denise Welch, whose reputation for speaking her mind without filter preceded her. Dressed in an elegant but understated navy dress, Meghan took her seat with practiced poise, greeting each panelist with a warm smile. But as the introductions wrapped and the conversation began, the tone shifted almost imperceptibly. The opening question from host Ruth Langsford was gentle, focusing on Meghan's advocacy work, and Meghan responded with eloquence, her voice steady and her hands gesturing naturally as she explained the goals of the program. Denise, however, didn't wait long to pivot. Leaning slightly forward in her chair, she asked, "Meghan, I think the work you are doing is commendable. But do you understand why some people feel you've distanced yourself from the UK in a way that comes across as a broken well, dismissive?" The audience murmured softly, sensing the potential for friction. Meghan's smile remained in place, though it had tightened by a fraction. "I think it's important to recognize that my decision to live where I feel safe doesn't mean I've dismissed anyone," she replied evenly. But Denise wasn't done. "You say safe. But wasn't it you who chose to leave the royal family, to step away from the commitments and duties that come with that role? There are people who see that as abandoning not just the institution, but the people it represents." Meghan shifted in her seat, her posture still upright but her expression sharpening. "Denise, safety isn't a privilege, it's a necessity. And when you're in an environment that threatens your mental health and your well-being, you have to make hard choices." Denise's eyebrows rose slightly, her tone cooling as she said, "Some might say you knew what you were getting into." The studio audience reacted audibly to that, some gasps, some murmurs, a few uneasy chuckles. Meghan leaned forward now, her voice lowering but gaining intensity. "No one knows what it's like until they've lived it. And unless you've been under that level of scrutiny, it's very easy to make assumptions from the outside." Ruth attempted to mediate, steering the conversation back toward Meghan's charitable work, but Denise cut in again, referencing Meghan's past interviews and suggesting that some of her claims had been inconsistently framed over time. "It's not about doubting your feelings," Denise said, "but when public statements change or details shift, people start to question the truth." Meghan's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "What you call a shifting details is often just people finally hearing the full context of something the media rarely provides." The tension was now palpable, the audience sitting in rapt silence as the two women exchanged increasingly pointed remarks. Colleen Nolan, sitting next to Denise, glanced between them with visible discomfort, while Janet Street Porter scribbled notes on her cue cards, clearly ready to jump in if needed. Meghan's voice was calm, but the steel in it was unmistakable as she continued, "It's interesting that my integrity is constantly questioned, while the people and institutions that have actively perpetuated harm are rarely held to account." Denise folded her arms, leaning back slightly but keeping her gaze fixed on Meghan. "With respect, Meghan, it's not about holding anyone above scrutiny, it's about being transparent when you're in the public eye." Meghan let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Transparency works both ways, Denise. And I've yet to see the same level of interrogation applied to those who've worked hard to control the narrative about me." At this point, the discussion had strayed far from the segment's planned talking points, and the producers in the control room were scrambling to decide whether to let it play out or to intervene. Meghan's composure was still intact, but her eyes flashed with an unmistakable frustration that signaled this was no longer a polite disagreement, it was a clash of worldviews playing out in front of millions. Denise, emboldened by the live format, pressed again, "If you want the narrative to change, Meghan, maybe the first step is to stop feeding it." The words landed like a spark in a room full of kindling, and Meghan's response was measured but edged with defiance. "Sometimes the only way to take power back from a false narrative is to speak directly to the people, even if it means ruffling feathers along the way." The air was taut with expectation, every member of the audience leaning forward in their seats as if waiting for one of them to finally break. And though no one knew it at that moment, this exchange was only the beginning of what would become one of the most talked about walkouts in daytime television history. The air in the Loose Women's studio was charged now, almost humming with tension. Meghan had just delivered her pointed remark about taking power back from a false narrative, and the audience's mixed reactions, to some clapping in support, others murmuring in discomfort, only amplified the crackling energy between her and Denise. Ruth tried again to steer the conversation toward safer ground, attempting to pivot to Meghan's experiences as an actress before joining the royal family. But Denise, leaning forward with an expression halfway between curiosity and challenge, interrupted before Meghan could answer. "You talk about speaking directly to the people," Denise said, "but don't you think that constant interviews and documentaries just keep the drama alive? At some point, isn't silence the more powerful choice?" The remark was delivered calmly, almost innocently, but Meghan's eyes hardened as though she'd been hit with a familiar, well-worn accusation. "Silence only serves those who benefit from the lie," Meghan shot back, her voice firm. "If I had stayed silent, the story about me would still be entirely crafted by people who have never met me but think they know me better than I know myself." The studio was so quiet now that even the faint buzz of the stage lighting seemed louder. Denise tilted her head, her voice still cool but with an undercurrent of disbelief. "But Meghan, some would argue that you've had plenty of chances to tell your side, and each time, you add something new. Can you see how that looks to the public?" Meghan's shoulders squared, her tone sharpening. "What you're calling adding something new is me finally feeling safe enough to share more. There's a difference between changing the story and revealing more of it when you're ready." Colleen Nolan glanced uncomfortably at Denise, as though silently urging her to back down, but Denise pressed on. "So there's more we don't know?" she asked, her voice carrying a note of skepticism that made the audience stir. Meghan gave a small, incredulous shake of her head. "Of course there's more you don't know. There's more you'll never know, because some of it is private and some of it is painful beyond words. But that doesn't make what I've already shared any less true." Her voice was beginning to waver, not with uncertainty but with restrained emotion. Janet Street Porter interjected briefly, trying to diffuse the rising intensity with a quip, but the tension between Meghan and Denise had already eclipsed the rest of the panel. Denise leaned back, crossing her arms in a way that seemed both defensive and defiant. "All I'm saying," she added, "is that when you step into the public arena, you can't control how people see you. That's the trade-off." Meghan's lips pressed into a tight line, her eyes locked on Denise's as if weighing whether to continue the exchange or walk away. "There's a difference between not controlling how people see you and watching them be spoon-fed lies," she said finally, her tone quieter but more dangerous for it. The audience murmured again, some clearly on Meghan's side, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Denise gave a small shrug, as though the point wasn't worth arguing further, but the damage was done. The conversation had crossed a threshold from spirited debate into something more personal. Meghan's breathing had quickened ever so slightly, and her hands, clasped on the desk, betrayed the faintest tremor. Ruth attempted to step in once more, her voice overly bright as she segued into a pre-prepared audience question, but Meghan didn't respond right away. Her gaze lingered on Denise for a heartbeat too long, a silent message that needed no words. It was in that moment, a tense, unblinking that the audience sensed the energy in the room shift again. The charitable project Meghan had come to discuss was now an afterthought. The headlines forming in producers' minds were no longer about mentorship programs or humanitarian aid, they were about the live clash playing out before their eyes. And as the next exchange loomed, it was becoming clear to everyone in the studio that this confrontation was heading toward a breaking point. The moment of unbroken eye contact between Meghan and Denise lingered in the air like static before a lightning strike, and when Meghan finally turned her gaze away, the shift wasn't toward retreat, it was toward resolve. Denise, perhaps sensing that the audience was divided and unwilling to relinquish her position, leaned back in her chair and spoke with a measured, almost casual tone that made her words cut deeper. "You know, Meghan, there are plenty of people who've been through far worse in the public eye and haven't felt the need to keep talking about it. Sometimes resilience means getting on with it without making it the center of every conversation." The remark was met with a sharp intake of breath from several audience members, and even Colleen Nolan's expression hardened in quiet disapproval. Meghan froze for the briefest moment, her lips parting as though to respond immediately, but she paused, took a deep breath, and sat forward. When she spoke, her voice was calm but laced with unmistakable steel. "Denise, resilience isn't about silence. Resilience is about surviving and still finding the courage to speak, knowing that every time you do, someone will try to diminish you for it. What you just said isn't resiliency, it's erasure." The studio erupted in a mix of applause and murmurs. The live audience clearly split between admiration for Meghan's response and discomfort at the intensity now dominating the conversation. Denise smirked faintly, as though amused by the reaction, and replied, "Or maybe it's just about moving on instead of staying stuck in the past." Meghan's composure finally cracked. "You think I'm stuck in the past? I live with the consequences of it every single day. The past you're telling me to move on from still affects me in the present. It affects my family, and it's not something you just brush off because it makes other people more comfortable." Her voice rose not to a shout, but enough that every syllable seemed to reverberate against the studio walls. The camera caught a tight shot of Meghan's face, her eyes blazing with controlled fury, her jaw set. Denise shrugged, clearly unwilling to back down, and replied, "I'm just saying the public gets tired of hearing the same grievances." That was the breaking point. Meghan sat back slowly, as if the weight of the entire exchange had finally reached its limit. Her hands unclasped, one moving to smooth the fabric of her dress while the other rested on the table, fingers drumming lightly. She turned to Ruth, bypassing Denise entirely, and said with deliberate clarity, "If the public is tired of hearing it, maybe they should stop asking me to relive it on national television." The applause this time was louder, more sustained, and for the first time during the interview, Denise didn't immediately respond. Meghan's eyes flicked toward her briefly, then back to Ruth. "I came here today to talk about empowering young women, not to justify my right to tell my own story." Her tone made it clear that the conversation was no longer negotiable. The panel sat in awkward silence for a moment, unsure whether to attempt another question or to let the tension dissipate on its own. But Meghan didn't give them the chance. She leaned back in her chair, exhaled slowly, and muttered just loudly enough for the microphones to catch, "I don't need to sit here and be disrespected under the guise of conversation." That was when she reached for her glass of water, took a small sip, and placed it back down with deliberate precision, an action that, in hindsight, seemed to signal that the walkout was imminent. The producers in the control room were already frantically gesturing at the floor manager, unsure whether to cut to commercial or risk letting whatever was about to happen play out live. The studio audience was transfixed, the energy no longer that of a talk show but of a standoff moments away from its inevitable flashpoint. Meghan adjusted the microphone clip to her dress, her gaze sweeping once more across the panel, then lingering on Denise. It was not a look of malice, but one of finality, a silent acknowledgement that the conversation had gone as far as it could. The room was so quiet you could hear the faint rustle of papers on Janet's desk. And then, with one final steady breath, Meghan's next words made it clear, "I think we're done here." The moment Meghan uttered the words, "I think we're done here," the entire studio seemed to hold its breath. For a beat, no one moved. Denise leaned back in her chair, her lips pressed together in a tight line, while Ruth's eyes darted to the floor manager as if silently pleading for a signal on what to do. Meghan's hands moved with a calm deliberation that made the action even more powerful. She unclipped the microphone from her dress, the faint crackle of static audible through the speakers, and set it neatly on the desk in front of her. "Thank you for your time," she said, her voice steady but unmistakably final, and though the words were polite, the undercurrent of resolve was impossible to miss. The audience's reaction was instant and divided, a half erupting into supportive applause, the other half murmuring in shock. Denise shifted slightly in her seat, as if to respond, but Meghan didn't give her the opportunity. She rose from her chair in one smooth motion, smoothing her dress with one hand while the other tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. The studio cameras instinctively followed her, the producers in the control room torn between cutting to a wide shot or staying close on the moment that was clearly going to dominate headlines for days. As she stepped away from the desk, Meghan paused briefly beside Ruth, offering a courteous nod and a quiet, "I appreciate you," before turning to walk toward the edge of the stage. Denise called after hearing Meghan, "This was just a discussion." But Meghan didn't slow her pace. Her heels clicked sharply against the studio floor, each step punctuating her silent refusal to re-engage. The audience's applause swelled again, mingled with gasps and murmured commentary as she reached the curtain at the side of the set. A stagehand, caught off guard, quickly moved aside to let her pass. The camera caught one final glimpse of Meghan's profile, chin lifted, expression calm but unyielding before she disappeared behind the curtain. The moment she was gone, the panel was left in an awkward vacuum. Ruth cleared her throat and attempted a hasty transition. "I'll write a broken bar well. We'll be back after the break." Janet scribbled furiously on her cue cards, clearly preparing her thoughts for when the show returned, while Colleen kept her gaze fixed on the table, avoiding Denise's eyes entirely. Denise, for her part, gave a small shrug and muttered, "Well, that's a shame," though her voice carried an edge that suggested she knew exactly what kind of headlines this would generate. In the control room, producers were already cueing clips to replay the walkout in slow motion for the next news cycle. Social media lit up within minutes. Hashtags like #MeghanWalksOut, #LooseWomenClash, and #Denise vs Meghan began trending worldwide. News outlets scrambled to grab the footage, dissecting every glance, every pause, every word exchanged. Commentators speculated about what this meant for Meghan's public image, whether it would strengthen her narrative as a woman unwilling to tolerate disrespect, or feed into the criticisms that she was overly sensitive. But inside the studio, as the break played and the audience buzzed with whispered debates, there was a lingering sense that something significant had happened, something raw and unfiltered that daytime television rarely captured. Meghan Markle had walked onto the Loose Women set intending to talk about empowerment, but she had walked off having made a statement of a different kind, that she would not allow herself to be cornered, diminished, or disrespected in the name of discussion. And whether viewers loved her or loathed her for it, they all knew one thing: this was a moment they wouldn't forget.